The AMD Phenom II X6 1035T is one of the first mainstream 6-core CPUs to hit the market back in 2010. This CPU features 6 cores and 6 threads and has a base clock speed of 2.6 GHz with a turbo up to 3.1 GHz. And it also has 768 kilobytes of L1 cache, 3 megabytes of L2 cache, and 6 megabytes of L3 cache. This CPU also supports DDR2 RAM and DDR3 RAM. Yes, this 6-core CPU supports DDR2 RAM. I found that weird too. And as 6-core CPUs become more common in 2023, I want to take a look at this CPU and see how it holds up in some modern games and tasks. This CPU does lack some instructions that newer games and programs require though, so this may not go too smoothly. The motherboard I am using for this is a ASUS M4N68T MV2, which is a low-end motherboard from its time, and it also has a really weird and unappealing name. But it does allow me to overclock the CPU. I overclocked the CPU to 3.1 GHz, which is the highest overclock I can get to be stable, but this is a 600 MHz increase over the base speed, which is very nice. I am also pairing this with 16 GB of DDR3 RAM running at 1066 MHz. Normally this RAM runs at 1600 MHz, but this motherboard does seem to only want to go to 1066 MHz. And I am also pairing this with a Nvidia RTX 3060 graphics card to avoid any graphics card bottlenecks. Without further ado, let's get into the benchmarks. For the benchmarks, I will start off with the games. So, Overwatch 2 at 1080p on the high settings ran at roughly 95 frames per second on average and had a 1% low of roughly 30 frames per second. So, not the absolute most ideal 1% low, but all in all, I would say it was a very nice experience, and there's not really anything else I can say about Overwatch 2. Roblox at 1080p on the highest settings ran at roughly 75 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows were around 35 as well. So the 1% lows again weren't very ideal, but they weren't bad either. And the game ran perfectly fine. The FPS will vary by map, so some maps may perform worse. I have seen some maps get less than 60 frames per second on average, but the average overall is above 60. On Minecraft Java with these mods, with these settings, which are roughly the medium settings, with the complementary shaders, the game was running really nice. It was getting roughly 85 frames per second on average. Now, the 1% lows were where the problem was. The 1% lows were 1 frame per second. So, that is horrible. And I don't exactly understand why, besides maybe the fact this CPU just has a really bad single-core performance. I also tried Minecraft Java on the same settings without shaders, and the game ran at roughly 250 frames per second on average because shaders are actually CPU intensive as well as GPU intensive, so the CPU was being taxed less, which made the FPS higher, and the 1% lows were roughly 20, so they were actually better than with shaders, but they still aren't great. Valorant at 1080p on the very high settings was running at roughly 120 frames per second on average, which is absolutely amazing, and I didn't notice any stutters. Though there is a slight catch. I couldn't see the frame time graph, and I couldn't really see what frame rate we were getting, besides just a little tiny frame rate monitor that is built into Valorant. The reason why is MSI Afterburner / Rivia Tuner, which I used to go and show the frame rate, did not work. When I enabled the overlay, the game would crash, and if I enabled the overlay before opening the game, it would crash immediately and not even open. But overall, the game felt quite nice and very playable. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p on the medium settings was running at roughly 60 frames per second on average. Yes, 60. That is actually more than I was expecting, and that is actually quite playable. Yes, it did drop below 60 frames per second pretty often, and it did go above 60 as well. But it didn't stutter either. It was actually a quite smooth experience. So all in all, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is pretty impressive. Dying Light 1 at 1080p on the high settings was getting roughly 70 frames per second with a 1% low of around 40, and that is on the outside in the wilderness. And on the inside of the starter building, the frame rate is in the 150s, which is also very nice. It is so nice in fact that I played for about 3 hours, and and I completely forgot I was even playing on the AMD Phenom. Fall Guys at 1080p on the high settings was running quite nicely, so in the spawn area, the game was getting roughly 70 frames per second, but later in the game, the average frame rate bumped up to roughly 110. The weird part of this is, I was graphics card bound, and the even weirder part of this weird part is, the wattage that the graphics card was using was less than 100 watts. So I have no idea how it was using so little power, and why it was pegged at 100% usage. No clue, but that's a thing. Borderlands 3 at 1080p on the medium settings was running okay. It was getting roughly 45 frames per second on average, and it had a 1% low of roughly 9. So, not ideal. I would definitely know that I'm playing on a Phenom and not something extravagant, but it's still perfectly playable. And all in all, I'd say it's a pretty okay experience. And no, locking the frame rate will not get rid of the stutters. Rocket League is really easy to run, and it's not really a surprise, but it's running absolutely flawlessly on this computer. So it's getting roughly 140 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows were around 70 to 80 frames per second. So all in all, I would say this is an absolutely amazing experience. Fortnite at 1080p on the medium settings was running at roughly, well, it depends. So, roughly 100 frames per second in the more empty areas, and in the big city, the game was dropping into the mid-40s in the frame rate. So, if you're outside of the cities, I would say this is a pretty good experience. The game does stutter quite a bit. It's not an unplayable amount of stuttering, but it does stutter. In GTA 5 at 1080p on the highest settings with the crowd density all the way down at the lowest, the game was getting roughly 75 frames per second on average. Outside the city, the frame rate was around 80, and inside the city it was around 60. So all in all, I would say it's a very playable experience, and hey, it wasn't even stuttery, so that's awesome. War Thunder at 1080p on the maximum settings was actually a pretty good experience. So MSI Afterburner does not work on this game, so instead I have to rely on the game's built-in FPS counter. And the game flew really smoothly, and the frame rate was around 120, though I did notice 1 or 2 stutters. So the 1% lows were roughly in the neighborhood of 20. Or at least they probably are. I have no way to verify that. PUBG Battlegrounds on 1080p on the medium settings on a AI match was getting roughly 45 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 5. So not very good at all. I also tried turning the settings to the very low settings, and the game refused to open. In fact, it crashed, and then it didn't open after that, even after verifying the game files. But one way or another, it is playable, but definitely not a very good experience. New World at 1080p on the low settings was running at roughly 25 frames per second inside of the towns, with dips into the single digits, and then outside of the town, the game was running at roughly 40 frames per second, with dips into the 20s. So I guess outside of the town it's sort of playable, but inside of the town it's really not ideal. So if you do play this game on this CPU, you can do it, just don't go to the towns. Halo Infinite at 1080p on the low settings was weird. So when I tried opening the game, it gave me an error saying the CPU doesn't have SSSE3, which is correct, it is missing instructions, and I thought the game wouldn't open. And it actually did, and the game was getting 100 plus frames per second, and it wasn't even stuttering. It was a very nice experience, though I'm not sure how the anti-cheat will deal with having SSSE3 gone. You might have a higher chance of getting banned like that, I'm not sure. CSGO at 1080p in the very low settings was running great. There's not really anything I can say about it. It was getting 120 frames per second, and the 1% lows were above 60. It was an awesome experience, buttery smooth, and I honestly couldn't tell the difference between this and a i9 1200K. BeamNG Drive at 1080p on the high settings, basically everything on high except grass quality, tire marks, and mesh quality. The game was running running at roughly 75 frames per second on average, and it was absolutely buttery smooth and very much playable. There were a few small stutters here and there, but it doesn't stop the game from being quite enjoyable and quite playable. BattleBit Remastered at 1080p on the Ultra settings was running at roughly 200 frames per second on average, and it ran perfectly fine. There weren't any stutters, and it was, well, a very nice experience. Now, I cannot guarantee the no stutters thing. The reason why is, in my testing today, I had no stutters. But when I had the CPU not overclocked, I was getting stutters down to 1 frame per second, just at times. But once the stutters happened, they went away completely. Ark Survival Evolved at 1080p on the medium settings was running at roughly 65 frames per second on average and had a 1% low of roughly 25. So the 1% lows weren't ideal, but all in all, the game is still absolutely playable, and I'd say it's a perfectly fun experience. But it is not all awesome. So do you remember when I said the CPU is missing instructions? Well, that prevents it from opening quite a few games and programs. Notably, Call of Duty Warzone 2.0, when you try to open it, it just goes and immediately crashes and doesn't even show any signs of it trying to open. Apex Legends tries to open, but then it gives me an error saying the CPU requires SSSC 3 and the game just doesn't open. I'm actually somewhat surprised about this because a i3-2120, which performs way worse, has SSSE 3 and can open the game. Oh well. Cyberpunk 2077, or as some people told me to say, Cyberpunk 2077, tried to open, and it went over and flatlined, which is equivalent to a crash. So the game doesn't open on this CPU. I also tried 3D Mark's benchmark called Firestrike, and that didn't work either. Instead, this just led to an entire computer crash, and not just a crash of the program. So the only way to start the computer again is by force shutting it off, and then turning it back on. And no, turning off the overclock did not help out with these problems, just Firestrike does not want to work on this CPU. But what does work is Cinebench R23. So on the multi-core test, the CPU got 2,607 points, and on the single core test it got 456 points. So the single core test is about as good as my Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad, but the multi-core test is significantly higher than both of those CPUs, and it is equivalent to roughly a i5-2400S to a i5-2400. And when it comes to video editing, this CPU did a perfectly fine job. So yes, importing videos and exporting videos does take longer than my i7-3770K or my Pentium G7400. This Phenom takes about 1.5 minutes to export 1 minute of video, so not bad. And the editing program I use is Movavi Video Suite 18. And now it is conclusion time. So do I recommend you to go out and buy a AM3 motherboard and also a AMD Phenom CPU in 2023? The short answer is no. The long answer is no. Although this CPU performed somewhat decently in quite a few games, you are still looking at $80 to build one of these computers with the used eBay prices currently. But if you were to go out and buy a LGA 2011 motherboard from a Dell Precision, for example, and stick a CPU in it like a Xeon E5 4650V2, which is 10 cores and 20 threads, and is 2.9 GHz, it will perform much better, and it will open basically anything, and it's cheaper. So there's not really any reasons to get a Phenom anymore, besides just out of the legacy of having a Phenom, because there are better options which are cheaper and perform better. So thank you for watching, and I hope this video helped you, and have a nice day.